Right.
Hi, Nina.
Hello there, Simon, and hello to everybody who joined us so far. As we did last week, let's give it a couple of moments for everybody to have a chance to actually log in, and then we'll dive right in.
Perfect. Yeah. Hello also from my side.
Right.
So second webinar in English this week, right, Nina?
Yep, that's what it is. Looks like last week went quite well, so whoever is here with us again, that is great.
Yeah.
And for all the newbies, also really glad to have you.
And the number of attendees is increasing, still increasing. Maybe we can give it another minute.
Yeah, let's wait until about 5:01, slightly un-German, but then we can kick it off.
But we're an international company, right?
There we go. All right.
Nina, one question. Do you see my mouse?
Yes, I do. And the
Okay,
screen
perfect.
looks sharp.
Perfect.
You hear well as well. Everything's working. Also,
Yes.
whoever is here with us already, if anything's not working, just let us know. Okay, should we kick it off?
Yes, please.
All right, sounds good. So once again, hello and welcome to our next round of construction industry versus Corona, or officially the impact of Corona crisis on the construction industry. So here with you today, the same as last week, myself as a host, my name is Nina and I'm responsible for sales development topics at Building Radar. And my colleague Simon, the in-house data analyst and the industry expert. You can
Hello,
give
everybody.
a short Great, thank you and welcome. So just a couple of housekeeping items for the start. We'll run through a short intro before diving into the data presented by Simon. So what this means is, as I mentioned during the last webinar, first of all, feel free to ask questions, feel free to raise topics. We want to make sure to try to answer most of them. And if we don't, we'll try to pick them up afterwards, or you can always write us an email or find us on LinkedIn. In any case, I think you'll notice, at least if you are with us and you were with us last week as well, we did take your comments into account and we expanded on some topics. So I think this will be exciting and interesting. So to dive into things, the short intro that I announced basically is about Building Radar. Why are we the ones to speak about the impact on the crisis, and why are we the ones who have this data? So Building Radar is a German company based in Munich. I mentioned in our last webinar as well, but we are operating worldwide. We are an artificial intelligence powered platform, which means that actually our technology allows us to search and read through construction data worldwide. The way that we do this is through reading a bunch of different type of information. So from early information, which counts for newspaper articles and anything out there that's in written form online, to public tenders and basically publicly available information online. The way we do this is actually through reading different types of text, so reading unstructured text as well as structured text, and then converting this into something that looks like a project on our platform. This is in the end what our customers use and what they're able to see. On the other hand, what we are able to see and use for our webinars is all of this data accumulated, where we can actually see the trends of the industry, the differences between last year and this year, and similar topics. So that's that from the intro side. And I'll let Simon present you the agenda of today's webcast and where we go from there.
Thanks, Nina. Thanks for the introduction. The agenda for this week looks as it follows. So as first point, we have updates on graphs we saw already last week, mainly for Europe and DACH, but also for the US. And the main topic for this week will be a comparison of different construction segments in Europe and also in the United States and in Asia. To add that, maybe from the technical side, as Nina explained, we are able to identify construction projects based on natural language processing in online text. We are further able to, with help of machine learning, to divide these construction projects into different segments, like office buildings, infrastructure projects, and some pretty interesting segments like bridge building, for example, which we will see this week. Yeah, and analyzing these different kind of segments will be the main topic of this week. But let's start with the updates for this week. This is a graph we show each week. So if you did not listen last week, I will briefly explain what this graph says and also what the idea is for our webcast. As you can see here, these are is the development of early stage information about construction projects in Europe, collected per week and displayed here for calendar week 6 of 2020 to calendar week 16. What we see here are 3 different developments. One development is we saw a weekly average increase of early stage information of 7% until calendar week 8. Calendar week 8 is also our first benchmark for this Corona crisis. In calendar week 8, the first lockdown in Europe with the lockdown in North Italy started. And basically the Corona crisis was present from this week on in the media, as you might remember, in Europe. The second benchmark is when probably in the German webcast I said when the German people were waken up by our Chancellor Merkel, by the already famous TV speech from Angela Merkel, when she announced pretty strict restrictions on going out, right, going to office, etc., as we all know. So this would be our second benchmark. And what we see between the first and the second benchmark is a sharp decrease in the number of early stage informations on projects in Europe of minus 55%. So this is surely connected to Corona. We will explain this further why we think that this is connected to Corona based on other graphs later. But what we definitely also see, and this is why we show this graph every week, is that we see a slight, I don't want to call it recovery, but maybe a pretty slight recovery since calendar week 12, and a more slight recovery or more, yeah, maybe it's a recovery the last 2 weeks in the number of early stage information for Europe.
Yeah, this is interesting to see actually between calendar week 12 and 16. There is now a slight recovery, but it's quite constant actually. So we had this massive drop of 55% and then it stayed roundabout on the same numbers. I'm really interested actually to see what the next week is going to look like if we're gonna go over this base that we're seeing right now, or if we're really going to make a jump there as well.
Exactly. So this is why we for sure will see this graph also next week. We also have this similar numbers for not for whole Europe, but for the region Germany, Austria, and Switzerland called DACH. We also see this weekly average increase of 7% until calendar week 8. We also see this sharp drop of 52% until calendar week 12, and we see a similar development of the early stage information for DACH than for Europe. This has surely to do with technical background of our data, because as we are not going too much into detail about the classifier and the technology, but Germany and DACH region is surely our strongest market, also in data coverage. So this is why we see here a similar development probably in the data for DACH and for Europe. Last week, for example, we saw that the information for Spain and Italy in terms of tenders decreased compared to other European countries. Yeah, but that's the main development for Europe and DACH.
Mm-hmm.
No questions so far, right?
No, we're all good for now.
Okay, perfect. So this third slide, or this on slide 7, what do we see here? We are still at the early stage information. We're looking or again to the DACH region, and what we're doing here is we compare the development of early stage information which are connected to private projects and to public projects. We see a decrease again until calendar week 12 in both sectors, but a stronger recovery in the public data than in the private data, data since then. This has surely to do with that the public sector in construction is most likely more resistant than private projects, for example.
Yeah, it's also interesting to see actually that the drop of public data was much stronger than the drop of private data if you look at the calendar week 12. And then of course the recovery of public goes up, which I think we'll have a chance to see a bit more in detail when we dive into the next slides.
Yes, next slide shall explain a little bit more. So these numbers are exactly the same numbers you saw on the previous slide, but for 2019. So what we see here, we have a similar development of private and public projects based on early stage information in DACH. We see a drop in calendar week 16. This is time of the Eastern holidays in last year, but we do not see this different development in the recovery as we see it here in 2020. And I think this is the most important insight from these slides.
Mm-hmm. Are there any differences also for other countries, or that's maybe what we look into later, right?
This is a pretty good question. We will see a little bit of that later. Exactly these numbers we did not compare for other countries so far. But
Okay.
we see an indicator for other countries, also the split of private and public projects. Yeah, this is one last slide for the updates. We saw this slide again last week. What do we see here? We see that the decrease of early stage information is 2 weeks delayed in the US compared to the DACH region. So we see this decrease in information for DACH from calendar week 7 on, and in the US 2 weeks later. So we have a lag of 2 weeks. Maybe if you also think about the media coverage of the coronavirus, started in China, arrived in Europe, and so from the feeling, it also was 1, 2, 3 weeks later, really occurring in the US press. But this is my my feeling, how I remember the media coverage.
And what we were looking at before, right, was the calendar week 8 was where we had the mark of the Italy lockdown, right?
Pretty good question. So what we say here is that the decrease starts with calendar week 7. If you remember the first 2 slides, we have this benchmark of calendar week 8. Mm-hmm. Where is it? Here. We have this calendar week 8, where this lockdown in Italy happened or started. This does not say that the number decreased from calendar week 8, but it's just this benchmark, this political benchmark. Mm-hmm. And further, this is an average number of the development per week since the beginning of the year.
Okay.
So pretty good question. And you see there are a lot of details inside our data, but the main insight here is that we have 2 weeks delay in in the decrease in DACH compared to US, and we see a similar, more or less similar development the last weeks. So that's for the updates. And now we arrive at the comparison of different segments for the European market. So as I explained, we are not able to identify construction projects online. We are also able to identify in which kind of segment these construction projects are located. This is done with help of machine learning tools. And what we see here is a random collection of segments, projects connected to the wellness sector, schools, fire departments, nursing homes, and a subcategory of infrastructure projects, bridge construction. So this is a pretty interesting and colorful collection of segments. But for all of them, we see this this drop at Eastern last year for the European data, and looking at the 2020 data, no, this is doubled, and looking at the 2020 data, we see what we call a clear corona effect. So in all segments, we have this decrease of data since calendar week 7. And we have no Eastern effect this year, most likely because we have this this decrease already in the data due to Corona.
Yeah, interesting also to see that very similar to what we were looking before. The data is recovering, and it's at least it appears that way, but it's also recovering in all sectors, which is, yeah, quite an insight.
Yeah, exactly. So, and if we're looking at another segment like hospitals, we see something we would expect. This is what we call a positive Corona effect in the hospital segment. And as you see, compared to the hotel segment, we see definitely a positive Corona trend, or maybe a hyper Corona hype in early stage information on hospitals. And still, it went down again due to Eastern and the last weeks, but it's still on a higher level than our data for hotels, which is quite impressive, because if you look at the difference in the total level before Corona, or when it started, this is yeah, another interesting insight. You also can see that the hotel sector started to decrease earlier, way earlier than calendar week 7, than other sectors.
Yeah, makes sense. Also, what's interesting is, or what I would love to see is in the next couple of weeks, whether the hospital graph is going to stay above what we had in the previous weeks, actually, because if you see it now, even now where the peak went down, it's still higher than what we were having from the beginning year up until the calendar week 12. So this is going to be something.
This is exactly what Paul told in the German webcast a couple of minutes ago.
I'm on the right way.
What do we also have? We have a comparison of the hospital segment with the apartment segment. And again, we see this positive Corona effect for the hospitals, this negative trend for the apartments as expected, but we also see that the apartment data recovers faster than the hotel data.
Yeah, definitely.
So most likely, I would say we see this or the next slide again next week. Also for school, we have a similar picture, a sharp decrease of data for schools, and this, of course, this hospital effect we saw before.
Yeah, this is going to be
so
interesting.
This would be
all
the
of
first
these
part
actually updates are going to be really interesting. Cool. All right.
So let's switch to the to another markets like the US. This is the relation of segments we saw before with the European data. This is early stage information for 2019. What we see here is no connection to Eastern for the US market. We see this slight decrease last year, but definitely not an Eastern effect like we saw for the European data. Maybe because the Easter holidays are also from the structure a little bit more different than in Europe than in the US.
Yeah, probably. I mean, from the DACH area, there's a lot of actually proper breaks happening in work, in economy in general. And I guess in the US, we're seeing, like if we compare really what you said, the Europe data had a proper drop in calendar week 16, and here we're seeing a rather flat curve.
Yeah. We are now in the international format now, but if you maybe look, or Nina, you probably know you live in Germany, so you know we have these strict or pretty how do you say pretty distinct breaks in holidays, right? For Easter we have our Christmas holidays, we have Pfingsten, etc. But maybe this is something we do not see for the US, where we have also a lower number of holidays days in the working contracts, for example. So this might be a reason for it.
Yeah, that
You're also
sounds
allowed
quite
to
reasonable.
work on or to open shops in other countries. You're not allowed to do that in DACH region on Sundays, for example.
Yeah.
So, but what's interesting, yeah, what we want to show here is not the 2019 data. We also want to show the 2019 data, but actually we want to show this Corona effect we also see for the US data, and I think this is pretty amazing. So we saw that the development in the similar segments was not equal for Europe and the US in 2019, but we see that we have pretty much the same Corona effect for the US data and the European data. And yeah.
Yeah, what's really interesting to see is actually, I mean, similar to how the whole spread happened, but this calendar week 12 really seems to be the tough point for all of the markets.
Yeah. And remember, this is our benchmark with the Chancellor speech of Angela Merkel. So maybe this speech was not only listened in Germany, but also worldwide. Okay. So we see the same negative Corona effect for the US. And what's also pretty amazing is that we see the same or a similar positive Corona effect for the hospital segment in the US. So this is again a comparison of hospital and hotel segment. We saw it for Europe and we see it here for the US. And I mean, Nina, you can interpret it, right? It's pretty much the same, right?
Yeah, what I would actually be interested to see is because of the different regulations that we have in the US and in Europe right now, how this hotel sector is going to be developing and going further in Europe versus in the US. This would be something that we can maybe look at next week as well.
This is pretty interesting. Yeah, I coincidentally also talked to hotels this week due to private issues, but they are really hoping that they will be allowed to open their hotels again in the next weeks. Otherwise, I think this number for the hotels will stay on a low level. Hopefully not, but could be.
Let's look at that definitely next week then.
Here we have a comparison between hospitals and apartments. Again, similar development. We see this drop in apartment data and a slight recovery. So basically, we see the same, and this is most amazing insight, right? That we see a similar effect for a specific segment for the US market and the European market.
Yeah, but this is also maybe interesting for us since we constantly talk about this 2-week delay. This is something that for everybody who's listening from the US or is at least operating in the US market, it's a pretty decent indicator if we look at the number of weeks that this keeps on happening, what will kind of come in the near future. So yeah, we're happy to share this data later on too.
Yes, I think we will provide this data for download, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And in this download, you will also find this comparison where we now see a difference, or basically we see the same information we saw, but just in the same slide. So we have the data for Europe and for the US. This is not only the 5 segments we saw before, but all segments accumulated, and we still see this Eastern drop for Europe and this more or less constant development in the data for the US. And as you can see here, accumulated all segments, we see our drop in the data for the US and Europe, and a slight recovery for the European data, no recovery, at least the same level for the US data.
Yeah, and this is exactly what I meant. This is potentially quite a good indicator for what will happen in calendar week 18, 19, that it might come, this kind of increase that is happening in Europe. And I will definitely keep this information also in mind for us to review in the next couple of weeks and to see if we're right with this assumption or if we're getting it completely wrong.
I think we can highly rely on this data. As you can see here, remember the 2 weeks lag. We can see this 2 weeks lag also here. So remember, this is just the comparison of the segments, and we see this decrease starts in calendar week 7 for the European data and in calendar week 9 for the US data.
Yeah, true. Interesting.
Oh, so this is a hard switch to the Asian data. I will switch. Do we have any questions?
I think we are all good. Yeah.
And we're also good in the time because this is our last slide. And what we want to show here is, yeah, what do we want to show? There is also a corona effect for our Asian data.
So the reason actually why we went on with this slide was we've gotten some information about Asia in our last webinar too, and also in some of the conversations with our clients and potential clients. So we wanted to just take not a full deep dive into Asia like we did for Europe and US, but just kind of an overview of what is happening in Asia. Are these weeks also somewhat matching? Are we completely off? To try to understand how differently does the market actually function comparing to where our main focus from Building Radar side actually lays.
Exactly, and what we see here is we see a corona effect. You might wonder why the level of the 2019 data and the 2020 data is so different, and this is, I think, pretty much also biased due to our data, and this we should be pretty open with that because the Asian market is not the earliest markets. We are a German-based company, and we started with the European market, US data, and this could also be so. The interesting part is that we see this drop in the data, not in the total level.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I mentioned it in the last webinar. I'm not sure I brought it up this time, but always, of course, bear in mind, this is not all the absolute data available out there. We are reading a certain amount of data. We are reading actually millions of articles also on a daily basis. But surely there are areas in which we are not as strong, and we are looking to get more data sources to make sure that we're reading more and more. But when we're talking about Asia specifically, don't take it to heart if something is missing.
Exactly. Okay, one last slide, the summary, and we're pretty good in the time, so we still would have time for questions. But as short summary for this week, we see a slight recovery in the early stage information for Europe and DACH in the last 2 weeks. So this recovery continued, this slight recovery. We also see that the public construction sector seems to recover faster than the private sector in DACH, especially in comparison to the 2019 development in 2019 and this significant difference in the recovery for this year. Then in the main part in section 2 and 3 we showed we presented a negative Easter effect for the data for Europe, but no Easter effect for the US. So we saw a different development in the 2019 data, and the big insight is that we see for both countries, for Europe and the US, we see a negative corona effect in overall segments, and positive corona effect for a segment someone would expect a positive corona effect, and namely the segment hospitals, again for Europe and for the US.
That is interesting.
That was it for this week.
Yeah, I mean, like you said also in the previous slide, basically, and that really goes into what we are going to be covering next week. I was mentioning throughout the slides too. We'll make some more comparisons, and specifically we'll look into are we correct in our assumptions that the US is following closely after Europe, which seems to be correct so far, as well as look into some more comparisons in different sectors. Are hotels recovering? Are they recovering at a different speed in different regions? And then whatever else that you feel like is a really good topic for us, feel free to message us further, and we're happy to look into the data and cover that as well. What we have here on the screen now is basically just an announcement for our next webcast, which is next Thursday, same time, same place. You can click on the same link. And if you have anything so far, any questions or suggestions, feel free to contact Simon directly on the email that's on the screen, or reach out to any of us via LinkedIn or other networks. Good. We are actually quite good on time there, just 2 minutes over. I'd like to thank to everybody who is still with us here, and I look forward to welcoming you next Thursday again.
Thanks everybody. Thanks Nina.
Thank you.
And have a good